Thank you for the welcome, David, and thank you all for coming today. I don't need that. I've got my own lapel mic. I think that works. Yes, I've been involved in Yorktown, interested in Yorktown in particular, the subject of the talk today for quite a while. What I'm going to do today is to just give you a bit of a background of the early history of Yorktown when it was established, and then come forward to what the West Home Historical Society has done on the site since then and what we found in more recent years, hence the title Then and Now. This is something you'll probably all be familiar with. It's Matthew Flinders' chart of the head of the Tamar Valley, 1798, of course, being George Bass circumnavigated Tasmania and proved that it was an island, and in fact discovered Bass Strait. And the discovery of Bass Strait essentially, rather than the discovery of Tasmania, Bass Strait meant it was a quicker voyage to Sydney instead of going around the dangerous southern tip of Tasmania, Van Diemen's Land at the time. And so the protection of Bass Strait was of high priority to the British government, and hence this is why essentially Tasmania was founded. William Patterson at that time was a lieutenant colonel in the British Army in the 102nd Regiment, which was the New South Wales Corps. He was stationed in Sydney. He was the second in command of the colony behind Philip Gidley King, and he was essentially had a few arguments with King. There was a difference of opinion at various times, and despite the fact that they were friends before and friends afterwards, there were some disputes. And I think Patterson wanted to get away from Sydney, and so he either volunteered or King volunteered him to establish a settlement in Tasmania. The British government, as I said, were worried about Bass Strait. They'd sent out David Collins to... I can get rid of it, like so you can see me. Better. Actually, I can see you all now, sorry. You can see me, that's the main thing. So where was I? Back to Patterson and King. David Collins had been sent out by the British government to establish a settlement, and he had settled at Port Phillip. He was decided, of course, that Port Phillip wasn't suitable, and so he sent the Lady Nelson, which was the ship that was well used in the early settlement of Tasmania, sent that to explore the Port Dalrymple, as it was known at the time, to see if that was suitable. William Collins, who's not related to David Collins, came up the Tamar River and discovered that the plains around what is now Launceston were excellent. He was very fulsome in his praise of it, but he had also when David Collins decided that he had already made the decision to go to Hobart and take his settlement of people to Hobart. So, despite the fact that the good reports of the Port Dalrymple were provided, Collins went to Hobart, and hence Hobart essentially became the capital of Tasmania. It could have been otherwise if he had decided to come to Port Dalrymple, but then that's a whole other story, isn't it? So, at this time, Governor King in Sydney wasn't aware that Collins had established a presence or was establishing a presence in Bass Strait, so he was under orders to establish a presence in Bass Strait, so he sent William Patterson, or Patterson volunteered himself to come down to settle. So in May and June of 1804, they gathered together two ships and set off. Because it was winter, sailing ships didn't go too well in Bass Strait, and it was pretty rough. They had to turn back, and after trying to get across Bass Strait, and so they turned back and ended up, some of the reports of the soldiers that were on board said they were still in sick bay 2 months later. That didn't. What about the convicts? Of course, they never got mentioned, but some of them must have had a pretty terrible trip and voyage. So they took a bit more time this time, and so in November 1804, Patterson set sail again. This time with 4 ships, including HMS Buffalo, which is the Royal Navy ship in this part of the world, and the records indicate 181 people accompanied him. We found names of 205 people that were actually on board the 4 ships. I don't think they counted the women and children, I'm sorry. Back at that time, they only counted the people that they were actually feeding, and the women and children had to find their own food or the rations of their partners and share their rations. So I'm sure they gave them some, but officially they weren't on the register. This is some of the things we found in this time period. And so Patterson landed. I'm skipping through some of this. Many of you will know the basic story of this part. Although I must confess that quite a few of the historical records in the past have gone wrong. So this is part of the reason for the book, was to try to tell the story from latest records. We ended up getting records from the Public Record Office in England that I don't think anyone had ever seen before, and various Mitchell Library and other records about Northern Tassie that enabled us to tell what I hope is an accurate story. Of course, history is always changing, and there's always other records to be found and improved upon. This was the voyage of the 4 ships that came down. They also had extreme difficulty in the weather. They had to put into Twofold Bay. They had to put in at one of the islands on that strait, and they eventually linked into Port Dalrymple. And of course, when they got there, there was a storm, and the Buffalo was pushed aground and had to be towed off by one of the other ships. They lightened the load by unloading the stock at Lagoon Beach, and then once it refloated, they went around the corner into Outer Cove, which is the present site of Georgetown, and offloaded the people. Patterson had a demountable cottage, which he erected as his government house, about where the Anglican Church, just behind where the Anglican Church is in Georgetown at the present time, and established a temporary settlement there. After the ships had unloaded, they all disappeared except the Lady Nelson. The Lady Nelson, he commandeered the Lady Nelson to explore the Tamar River, and he went up river in the Lady Nelson, up here to Launceston, and explored up the North Esk River, and he was very fulsome in his praise, saying that there were 10,000 acres of land fit for cultivation. It was just the best place. And then he settles at Yorktown. Can't grow a thing. And the reason is, I believe, is that his instructions were to protect Bass Strait from French possible invasion. We know that didn't occur, but at the time it was a real possibility. They were at that time not at war with the French, but they were to be shortly after. They had been. They didn't trust the French, and so establishing at near the head of the Tamar so that they could guard against possible French invasion was important. The only freshwater source of reliable nature is at the head of Western Arm, the 2 streams that come in either side of Yorktown. And so Patterson decided to establish it. And by that time, at Georgetown, the water supply was getting very difficult, running out. This was November of 1804. And so he decided to make a move and establish it at Yorktown. He sent soldiers and convicts across to Yorktown to clear the site because they were worried of fires, and built some pretty basic shelters. He didn't actually say what they were built of, but we've since discovered, when we get to the archaeology part, what they were built of. And so he built the huts for these 181 people. The only problem was that Governor King had sent down another 85 people in March. He'd only just established Yorktown, and he had to then build and feed another 85 mouths. He was also given 612 cattle, which you might think is terrific. Here we can feed them all. However, they cost £16,500 to the British government, and he was under strict orders not to eat any of the cattle until their numbers were increased above the 612 that had been landed. And of course, they come from India on the ship the Sydney, which was a chartered ship, and the captain, at the time the ship was sent away to get the cattle, Governor King knew there was settlements happening either in Hobart, Port Phillip or Port Dalrymple, and he wasn't sure where the cattle were going. So he told the ship's captain to call in Elephant Bay on King Island. There was a sealer's hut there, and in the sealer's hut, in the rafters, he would leave a bottle, and in the bottle would be the name of lucky place to get the cattle. Port Dalrymple was there, and of course that was found. The ship came, Sydney landed at Port Dalrymple in March and unloaded the cattle. They come on a long sea voyage from India to March, starting to get a bit colder in Tassie. Different feed, different climate, long sea voyage. They died. And they died quickly. Patterson had to get all of his convicts looking after them over at Outer Cove and Lagoon Beach. And the soldiers had to guard the convicts, of course, but they were all trying to keep the cattle alive. They put them in slings, they fed them, hand-fed them, they brought feed to them, they built shelters for them, and they still continued to die. So Patterson, this basically occupied pretty much all of Patterson's time in this first time period. We've got a problem. Something's. I'll just speak louder. No, it just seems to cut in and out. I apologise for that. I'll hope everyone can hear me. If you can't, just put your hand up and I'll speak louder. It's gone out again, has it? Yeah. It's an intermittent fault. That's right now.
Now.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, I'll have to bring that back and we'll have both, or one or the other. So the cattle continued to die, so Patterson decided to move them across the Tamar to Clarence Point. Sorry, he moved them across by boat across to Clarence Point. They still continued to die, so he discovered some, and of course the water was, in November, December, January, the water was starting to, this was March, it had gone through winter. Water had gone through winter and summer was starting to happen, and so water was getting scarce. He moved them by land across to a place at Rowella. We've actually discovered a well that's on the private property there, which we think dates back to this original 1805 settlement. We did an excavation on it. We didn't find any artefacts, but it certainly had water in the bottom of it because an echidna was using it as a water source. And so after we dug it out, we put some rocks in to help it get it in and out of the water source. So it was certainly, this was up on top of a hill. It was overlooking an area, a marshy, swampy area, and that's the feed that the cattle use. So Patterson then decided to, after that started to dry up in November, he decided to move the cattle up to the natural pastures up here in the North Esk River. And so he hired Jacob Mountgarrett, who was the doctor. He hired his flat-bottomed punt to move the cattle up to the North Esk River. He moved them up and only lost one extra cow in that process. And once the cattle were up here, they started to thrive, and he crossed them with an English bull. That's the Lady Nelson that you're all familiar with, presumably. That and the one at the front is the cow. The calf is the one at the back. Crossed with an English bull, and so they started to thrive up at here in Launceston. They were on Old Mac's farm. It wasn't called that then, of course, but that's where that's about as far as you could at that stage navigate up the North Esk River, so they could offload the cattle, and it formed a bit of a natural corral as well. With the hills coming down, they were able to keep them. And so, in fact, I believe that was probably more likely where the first settlement of Launceston occurred, rather than the blockhouse in Brisbane Street, which is traditionally indicated. I found no evidence of contemporary time of that blockhouse occurring. In fact, Launceston developed closer up towards City Park, where David said the government house was, because that's where Patterson chose for his house. And in 1806, Surveyor General Charles Grimes came here and he surveyed parts of Yorktown and parts of Launceston, and he located a number of buildings around the Brisbane Street area. In fact, where I worked, 23 Brisbane Street, and further along that top side of Brisbane Street, which I think was the first area where the first buildings in Launceston actually occurred. So don't believe everything you see on a written sign. Like the sign that's actually at the government house, which is completely incorrect, which is why the Launceston Historical Society placed it more correct at this point in time. Sign. That may change over time as more information is available. So back at Yorktown, Launceston was starting, the cattle were here. He had half his soldiers and half his convict here. Governor Blythe by this time taken over in Sydney. And he was starting to show his irascible best, because he said to Patterson wanted more troops. He said, I've got 2 settlements, I need more troops, I can't keep the convicts at bay. He was having great difficulty with the convicts. They were escaping and having great difficulty, and so he asked for more soldiers. Blythe's solution was, don't have 2 settlements, just have 1. You don't need any more soldiers, you're not getting any more, that's it. Patterson, in March of 1805, at the same time as the cattle came and the 85 extra mouths came to feed, he had 5 Norfolk Island settlers arrive as well. They'd established at Anderson's Creek, flat ground there, and of course in winter when the rains came, the crops had started to grow well on the flat land, and of course they got washed away. The crops on the upper ground didn't grow at all, and so he moved the Norfolk Island settlers up here to just near Distillery Creek. I know where they were located, just up here at Distillery Creek. And some of the officers had crops there, Piper and Garrett. And so Garrett, of course, moved up and had 600 acres at Hogler's Bridge there, which he called Killafatty, which is where that name comes from. But we kept getting distracted. Elizabeth Patterson came at the same time in March of 1805, at the same time as the cattle and the 85 extra people. She was a cosy Scotch lass, was how she was described. She seems to have been pretty much a rock for Patterson. Patterson was rather sickly. He had conjunctivitis and a number of other ailments, which we don't know exactly what they were, but he was sick quite a lot. He was a very keen botanist as well, and he described animals and plants of Tasmania. In fact, the thylacine, the first sample, was caught at Yorktown and described by him and published in the Sydney Gazette in great detail. And so Patterson had some very great difficulties in those first years. Food supplies were short. He had to look after the cattle. Food was running out. Ships couldn't get through from Sydney because of the weather. He sent soldiers, he sent convicts with dogs to catch kangaroo. Of course, that caused problems with the Aboriginal population that had been living quite contentedly and in balance with the environment for 40,000 years. And then he turns up and immediately starts hunting kangaroos and destroying their food source. And of course, there was some conflict. So the convicts discovered once they could have access to dogs, if they stole a dog, they could live without having to be in the settlement. So they would steal a dog and go and live in a part of the country and not be a convict, or a wood ranger, as Patterson called it, which became bushranger. And of course, there were a lot of issues with Lemon and Brown, were 2 of the early convicts who escaped and killed 3 or 4 people and were killed themselves. One was sent to, was captured and decapitated, and his head went in, was taken to Hobart and to get the £50 reward for it, and the other one was sent back to Sydney and hung, drawn and quartered in Sydney Harbour. The soldiers, you would think, Patterson being the commanding officer, would have been all right, but they also objected because they didn't get their rum allowance. So they would sort of go on strike and were causing difficulties, and so Patterson had all of these problems to account with. And then, of course, In 1806, the ship Venus turned up with some much needed supplies, stopped at Outer Cove. The captain came up to introduce himself to Patterson, and the captain reported that I had some convicts on board that were a bit unruly on the voyage down. They threw some things overboard and they weren't very good. And so Patterson immediately sent a corporal to guard the ship. The corporal and the ship and the convicts disappeared. Pirated the ship, took it off to New Zealand. Some were apparently eaten. Some stayed in New Zealand. The ship went on to Chile, and some of them managed to go to South America, and eventually some got back to England. It's quite a story, but that is another story. And Catherine Pearce isn't here today, I don't think, but she's done a detailed story on that. The cattle continuing to die was a part of the factor of the weather. It was particularly cold. If you look down here, you've got some temperatures way below -5 in average temperatures in various months in June, July and August. And so it was particularly cold, and the cattle coming from India just did not like it. And Grimes turned up in 1807 and did some surveying around Yorktown, and you can see here he's so Yorktown. He had a flagpole. We found this in a field book, his original field book, which had been sent from Sydney to Hobart, and in that field book he had his notes. I don't think he ever produced a plan of Yorktown, or none that I've yet been able to find. Being a surveyor, I transcribed his notes, worked out his shorthand, plotted up what his survey was, and this is the result of his survey of the places he found and saw. And we've actually put the flagpole back in its close to the same spot. Fell under a tree, so we moved it slightly. But given the accuracy of that survey and my reconstruction of it, it's as close as we can reasonably expect. This is surveyor in Hobart, George Prideaux Harris, came up to Launceston, and he sketched that image of the cow and calf earlier. And he gave us the only vision, the only thing we have of, the only sketch, the only information we have of Yorktown. And you can see here is the store, the big building here, and a little sentry box here, and a larger building behind it. All contracted in terms of scale, but we think that was the main Patterson's cottage and the military barracks on the site. And up the top were the convicts and soldiers' huts. Patterson described it as a respectable looking village, hence the title of the book. I'm causing great problems with the technology. And so hence the title of the book. So there's we've counted up about 40 or so structures here in the village. And this is the other image he painted of the garden, with a waterfall here in the river. We crossed that fall and had a look. There's no sign of the path or the bench now, or any modern planting or any old plantings, but there is a pear tree on the other side of the river, which we think could date from that original time or shortly after Yorktown. So by 1808, 1808, Launceston was the headquarters. Yorktown was being virtually abandoned. Patterson had, of course, on 26th of January 1808, Governor Bligh had been overthrown by Patterson's second-in-command, Major Johnson, driven, of course, by John MacArthur. And so the rightful governor had been deposed, and Patterson was actually the lieutenant governor. He was actually then second-in-command once the governor was no longer in command. And so, in fact, Yorktown could technically be said the capital of New South Wales at that time. I know it's stretching a long bow. So Patterson was here, and he was in back in charge. Johnson was taking the command through force by the New South Wales Court in Sydney, and so Patterson, we sent a ship down to Patterson to say, come back, please, come back and take the fall for my mutiny. Patterson said, oh, I'm sorry, I'm a bit not feeling too well, I don't think I can make it at the moment. So Johnson sent him another ship. And Patterson said, oh, look, I'm so sorry, I just can't come back. The ship's a bit small for my liking. Please send it, wait till the porpoise, that is ready. And last time I'd been in Port Dalrymple, I ran into a rock, funny enough, called Porpoise Rock. And it was still being repaired. So and a third time, he sent another ship, and Patterson said, oh, look, I'm not feeling the best at the moment. I'll just wait a little bit longer. So the fourth time, he couldn't get around it. By this time, England knew that Patterson wasn't to blame and that Johnson was the culprit. And so Patterson felt it was safe to return to Sydney. And he remained as effectively Governor of New South Wales, in assuming his Lieutenant Governor's role until Macquarie arrived in 1810. Some people were going to actually arrest Patterson when he arrived back. There was the pro-Bligh faction. There were plots to arrest him and depose Johnson. So it was a pretty difficult time. So anyway, once Patterson left, he left on 25th of December 1808. And he left with about 30 people that had come with him. The remainder of his, which was some of the soldiers, the remainder stayed here. In June of that year, June of 1808, 25th of June 1808, my ancestor was here at Yorktown, Private James Hortle. He'd come in 1806 with his wife and 4 children, and he was like 5 great-grandfathers, so I'm 7th generation from Tasmania. Some of you may also be the same, or even 8th. And so he was out on a patrol at a place called Boats Crew Point, which was near where the stores were landed, because they couldn't get up to Yorktown, and he was speared by the Aborigines and killed. I'm so pleased he was. And that's the response most people do. Because if he had lived, he would have gone back to England with his regiment. His son was in the regiment, and he went back to Sydney with the regiment, and he died of an unnamed English disease. Because the family stayed, his wife stayed, because the government didn't take wives and children of soldiers if the soldier was no longer alive, so they left them here. Because they stayed here, my third great grandfather stayed here, married, and I am me. I would not be here talking to you if he had not been speared, not died, and not stayed, and his family had not stayed. So Yorktown was now virtually abandoned, and Henry Barrett, who was a former convict, was in charge of what was remaining of the government gardens. He took some of the building materials to build his own houses, and basically the buildings just dropped where they were. Bushfires came through, some of the land was cleared by future owners. In the 1840s, they subdivided it into 1 acre blocks, and some people bought blocks, and only about 8 or 9 blocks were actually built on. Governor Macquarie visited in 1811, of course. He didn't rename it as Macquarieville or anything, but and this was Barrett in his hut at Yorktown before he passed away, and the remains of the hut are still there, and we've seen the site there. This was the cemetery. It was we've got names of about 24 people that we think were buried in this cemetery, about 8 at the Yorktown time, and then this served as a burial place on the West Tamar because there was nowhere else until they had to go across to Georgetown for any burial. So a number of settlers were buried here. So we've got names of about 24 or 5 people in the book that we think were buried here. We've actually done a ground penetrating radar survey of this, but couldn't positively identify any graves, although there's a couple of spots that look possible. It's just bush now, and no fence, nothing there to identify it. A reporter called the Scout in the 1880s came and visited and spoke to Barrett's son, and this was a mark out of the town at that time, and this is what appears on the monument that's at Yorktown at the present time. So the sketch proved somewhat accurate. This is the main settlement site here, and this is all we had to go on when we sort of got interested in this site. This is the monument I spoke of. So the site was basically abandoned. It was surveyed in the 1840s for 1 acre blocks. Some blocks were bought, some were built on, only about 7 or 8. Most were just left as 1 acre blocks. So anyway, around 2000 we got interested in the site, but before that in 1950, the Northern Branch of the Royal Society. Does anyone know who that organisation is? We were involved through the Secretary and wrote to the Director of Lands to say, with the 150th anniversary coming up, we think it might be appropriate to do something. And so they convinced them to buy some of the land here. So some of the land close to the road was purchased, and the Royal Society obtained funds of £250 and another £150 from somewhere else, for £250 from the government to build the monument. This was designed by the members of the Royal Society, and had a visit there and built the monument. And the map I showed is what's on the top plate of the monument there, and David had that sign on the original slide. And so in 14th of November 1954, the Governor, Sir Ronald Cross, opened this, and 300 people turned up, most that had been there since 1808. And in 2024, we had a Back to Yorktown Day, and another 300 people turned up as well to it. So 300 seems to be the magic number. 301 people were the number of people that were there originally. 300 came to the opening of this. 300 came to our Back to Yorktown Day as well. I don't know how we would have dealt with any more, but 300 was enough. So coming back to 2000, I've alluded to that before. Richard Hoopus, who some of you, OAN, who some of you may have known, was a force in the Beaconsfield area. He put an ad in the paper saying, anyone interested in Yorktown, could you come along and we'll have a look around. So I turned up, having my ancestor James Thornton being there, and we had about 20 people there. We turned up, and Richard, we had a look at the monument. He didn't know much of where anything was. Said he thought there was nothing left. Did we prove him wrong? Including him, he proved himself wrong. But we went in the bush, and there was a couple of bricks there, and he said, "Oh, there's a whole heap of bricks over the other way there." And I said, "Oh, let's go and have a look." He said, "No." "Oh, why, Richard?" "Oh, we want to have a look. This is what we're here for." He said, "There's a marijuana crop there. I'm a bit worried." So we waited until that was harvested and came back and had another look. They moved on. This is how wild some of this country was. This was only 50 metres from the main road down to Greens Beach. So we formed the West Home Historical Society with Richard President and myself Vice President, and Helen Phillips, who's the other co-author of the book, as Secretary Treasurer. We wanted to investigate Yorktown, which was sort of the fourth oldest separate settlement in Australia, behind Sydney, Hobart, Norfolk Island, and then Launceston. Some say the third, could be more. There's Parramatta to consider, but then there's Western Port, and anyway, look, there's debate about the number, but it's early. It's early. So we had a look at what documentation there was around, found Grimes's survey notes, plotted them up, discovered that the actual site itself wasn't where the monument was and where all the 10 acres that the government had acquired. It was another half a k further up on a nice hill, which would have at the time overlooked the river. And so we did some research. We found about 50 building sites bricks and remains of building sites in which we had an archaeologist document and record and prepared a management plan. Anyway, once we started, the main block which we discovered was Patterson's cottage, and the main administrative centre was up for sale. If someone had bought it, they would have built right where Patterson's cottage was, because it was the perfect spot to build. Top of the hill, looking out over everywhere, middle of the block. And so we were a bit worried by this, but okay, we found it after nearly 200 years, and now it's going to be disappeared. So we approached the West Tasmania Council, and to their credit, they believed us. Some of the councillors didn't. They said, how do we know those bricks are not 20 years old? You know, all this sort of thing. Just refuel. And so we convinced them eventually, through the aid of Barry Easter, I think mainly at the time, to buy this 2 hectares of the government house site. It meant there was private property between that site and where the monument was. And so, look, we'd approached Mrs. Wiley, who owned the land between the 2 sites, and we said, look, we've discovered that Grimes, in his 1806, there's a couple of houses that were here on your land. Could we have a look? And we went and had a look. There was gorses. Oh, is this room? But we bashed our way in. We found some bricks there. And we went to Mrs. Wiley and said, oh, look, there's all these remains here. And we said, what are you planning to do with the land? And she said, well, nothing really. Would you like it? We said, yes, please. We put it in the council's name rather than ours, because we think council are a long-term entity that are going to exist long after we've ceased to exist as an organisation. And so we set about clearing the land of gorse. She donated, it was head-high gorse, there's some of it. Just all volunteers. We cleared it. We can't get a machine in because it's going to destroy what's under it. So we cut and pasted it all and got rid of the remains. So it was a big job, and it's still an ongoing job. So we're still continuing to. It's a lesser job now, but we're still continuing to get it. We then set about. The council said, "Oh well, we're going to buy it, but you've got to open it up to tourists. We want to have money. We want to get some value out of this." So we had to open it up to the tourists. So we had to do a management plan. We had to get an archaeological assessment of the site. We needed some paths and a car park, put up some interpretive signage. The toilet came up, the council put up the toilet, so they paid 70 grand for the bio toilet. We did the rest, the car park, the paths, the signage, the plan, all of the rest. But we got a community fund grant for 91,000, which was quite an achievement at the time. They are somewhat difficult to get nowadays, more difficult than they used to be. But and I see some nodding around. I know a lot of people try, but they are difficult to get. Anyway, we got that, and I think we spent it wisely. We've opened up the site. We did some of this grant was also research. We had to get the information we got from the Public Record Office in Kew in England. We had to get A1 copies of these pages of the what we thought was going to be the list of names. We didn't know if it was. It cost us $1,000 to get this information. So we used part of the grant to get that, and it was gold. It gave us all the names on the list and more of the people that were here at Yorktown. And so that was one of the reasons we decided to do the book. That's the toilet, the background, the cars, the signage that we put up. The table and the barbecue were already there. They'd been put up by another organisation. And then we opened up the whole site. There's some of our volunteers there. These 2 volunteers were, that's one of the signs, that they were very keen on the natural beauty of the place. And so they helped us clear the gorse, and then they replanted it with native species to bring the birds and animals back. And part of the signage we put in later was some signs of animals down on the path, some of the animals you probably won't see in birds, and replaced the plants. And so we put some more signage in at a later stage. And going through the gate there, it goes up to the main site, which is a rise, which has got very nice blackwoods planted by someone in the past. They weren't there originally, but provides a pretty nice, quiet space. And as I said, we had a Remembering Yorktown Day with the 300 visitors. We did some tours and a play, and there was a block next door. Once we'd explored the area, the adjoining private landowners were very interested in helping us, and well, most were, not all. And they let us go onto their property, and we discovered that one of the blocks near the main monument, near the flagpole, had a paved area of bricks about the size of where I'm standing on at the moment. And so we convinced council to buy part of that block as well. We had an arrangement with the La Trobe University, which did a landscape archaeology thesis. This is the tour and a hut that we built. We had a tin shed there that was on the site storing our tools and equipment. So we built something that resembles, not copies, but just is more like the buildings that were there at the time. Basically, 2-room cottages. That's the Grim Reaper. Theft of the stores occurred in 1806, and 4 people were implicated in it and sent back to Sydney for trial. 2 soldiers and 2 convicts. Two of them were found guilty, and the 2 soldiers were found guilty and made convicts. They became convicts, and the 2 convicts were found guilty, and one was sent back here to Yorktown to be hung. He escaped and went back to his wife's hut and was captured because they put a guard there to capture him. And so this is a play with the soldier on guard. That's Mrs. Middlebrook. And the Grim Reaper's waiting for him to arrive. So he was hung at Yorktown, and the other was sent to Hobart to be hung at Hobart because food was scarce. It was a lesson to the convicts to not take the food. 2006, we did an archaeological dig with Adrienne Ellis. She's now a doctor. She got her doctorate from this at La Trobe University, and she did a dig. We did 3 sites: Government House, Riley's cottage, who was the storekeeper out on the point, and a soldier's hut. This is main Patterson's cottage. You can see some of the bricks here, and the trenches where bricks would be. This was where Patterson put his second demountable cottage and made it as Government House on the top of the block. And so you can see there's still quite a few bricks there in the ground, and we found a 1798 halfpenny. So we could tell council it was a. This was Riley's cottage out on the point. So some bricks there for a brick chimney, and once again we found a lot of nails on this. So from that we determined that it was probably a timber cottage. He had the means to get convicts to saw timber for him to make a timber cottage with brick chimney. And this is the soldiers' hut up in the top, and you can see the round holes here around the outside. That was for the posts for the lath and plaster construction. Brick base for a chimney, and the lath and plaster outline of it. We found the actual lock of the door, so they walked away and left the lock of the door. We didn't find the key, but we found the lock. We found musket balls, we found lots of china, we found daub from this, so this was, over 200 years old. They just walked away and left it, and it just collapsed into the ground. And it's still there. There's 20 or so convict and soldier huts up at the top there, which we've identified, which are still there in the ground. And this is some of the artefacts that we obtained. They went back to La Trobe University for collation and conservation, and then they've come back and they're at the Beaconsfield Golden Heritage Centre. And there's a display at the Beaconsfield Golden Heritage Centre about Yorktown. We produced a brochure as well to tell people about it. That's the coin, musket ball and buttons. Well, that's the musket ball, the other one's the buttons. This is the musket balls, 2 of them. We don't know if they were just dropped or if they were shot and ended up in a convict or something, but anyway, there's no blood on them, so probably just dropped. And a plate. We've managed to recreate quite a large portion of it. And this is a time capsule. It was things that were dropped between 1804 and 1808. So it's been really valuable from an archaeological point of view because, like the Sydney Cove wreck, which is here, and it gives you a very, very good date as to what was being used at that particular time. So we plotted a plan of the layout of the original 1808 remains that we found. The monument is down just here, and so you can see there's quite a bit extra. It wasn't heritage listed. The monument was heritage listed, but not the rest of the site. We've managed to get 100 hectares on the heritage register, including the private property and including out in the bay. We found enormous amounts of broken glass and other things out in the bay where they would be bringing goods in. And out on Soldiers Point where they landed the goods from the ships. So there's chimneys out there, and better preserved actually remains out on Soldiers Point, which we haven't touched or excavated. We've just protected them. We weren't able to do that at the time, so that's waiting for future generations to discover. We had a community coast care grant in 22,000 from the federal government to help us remove the gauze, put up some natural history signage, and we planted more native species on site to try and provide a better environment. We've got the 100 hectares heritage listed. Just on where the soldiers' huts were located, the owner at the time, Heath Graw, decided that we approached him and he said he'd sell us the land. He wanted a reasonable amount for it, as it was his right. So we managed to use some of the sales of the products that we produced and done, and we managed to get some grants. The Booth Trust provided us some money and we got it. The council said they didn't want to have any more historic land in the area. So the state government have taken ownership of this, and we just have to keep wary that they don't sell it, because they had a review here shortly after of the land they owned and they were going to sell it, but we managed to convince them and the cemetery that no, they shouldn't. So be vigilant. So we've written the book. Come out in 2020. It took us about 20 years to research and write it. The three parts of it is essentially, I've written the first 4 years of the original settlement. Helen Phillips, who was Secretary of Treasury, lives at Yorktown, and so she wrote the later history of Yorktown, taking it on when it was in private ownership. And Alma Ransom is a family history expert, and so she's written biographies of those 301 people that were at Yorktown instead of the 181 people that the government recognised were there. So those are the three parts. That's why it's so big. It's 3 books in one. Not bad value for $60. And that's Yorktown. That's where we are at the present time. We've put Yorktown on the map. We've protected it. We've saved it. We've researched it. We've given it its due place, I think, in Australia's history, which, if you think about it, Sydney, Norfolk Island and Hobart have all had multiple books written about the people that were at those settlements and details about the settlements. We think it's right that Launceston, Yorktown, gets its appropriate place in the place of Australian history, because it was once the head of government in New South Wales. Thank you.